people are waiting to get here. Can we ask, how did you get your job? How did you end up in this type of role?
So yeah, it was a funny path for me because I went to grad school as a physics undergrad, and I got my PhD in applied physics, philosophy, things like that. I came to Duke as a postdoc in the physics department, working with a woman that was faculty there that I had actually known in grad school, looking at calcium signaling in neurons and glial cells and stuff. Eventually, she left to get her PhD in clinical psychology instead. She kind of, radically shifted fields, and I ended up getting a position with a woman at Duke that was a professor that was split between computer science, where she taught visualization, engineering, where she ran a virtual reality lab, and art history, where she helped with their what they call the Visual Studies Initiative at that point. And so I worked on grant-funded projects for 7 or 8 years. But I like that work, but it's not super easy being on top of money constantly. And so when this position in the library opened up to do, short-term teaching and consultation stuff surrounding visualization, I was able to get that position. So then I've been, working in the library for 9 years. But it's kind of this gradual transition of doing research, but realizing I didn't have my own research agenda I wanted to pursue. I like helping other people with their work. And I've just always been interested in visual communication, photography, data visualization stuff. So this ended up being a really good match.
I don't think there's a direct line in his career.
No, there's not. And there's not a lot of training. Like there's some programs that teach data visualization stuff. There's a few places around the country, but it is one where almost everybody gets into it through some strange pathway. They're just drawn into it and get lucky in different ways. I never imagined I would be working in a library, but it's a great place to work. There's lots of colleagues who are smart, they care about helping other people. It's just like a really nice environment to work.
And actually, as a career person for the department, I just want to explain one word you said, because I think it's actually helpful. Soft money, if you've never heard that phrase before, that's something that's grant funded. So usually it'll be like, oh, you have a grant for a year or 2 years. And so you have a job, which is great. But then you're like, am I going to have a job after this 1 year or after 2 years? And so it can make a lot of instability for someone in a job that's on soft money.
Yeah. And for a while, I had someone that was my boss and could kind of search out money and help cajole people into paying me and all these things when money shifted around. But once she left, I was kind of working for various professors and people come and go. And for my personality, that instability was not a good match, even though I liked the work.
It seems to me that the majority of biostat professors are well over 50% soft money.
What's a good question?
I would guess so, right? Because not only a few of them teach. So a lot of biostat are full. Are there's very few that are hard money.
I think that's quite common for a lot of STEM fields, just because there's so much grant money out there for people to get. So that is certainly for a tenure track role when you're not teaching. If you're at a small liberal arts school, you'll be paid to be teaching and assisting students, and that's your job. But if you're one of your primary roles to do research, a lot of the time at universities, you are required to find research funding. So that's for some of our PhD students. They're like, I really like the work and research is interesting. I hate grant writing. I hate having to do this and having to find money every 2 years. But it definitely depends on what the setup is. We have some faculty who teach more, and so they don't have to.
And some people like looking for that money and the politics of it, and they're super good at it, and they love running labs. And that just wasn't for me. I like doing the day-to-day work. So my wife has moved up in administration, and I've stayed at the same level because I like doing the work. All right, should I go ahead?
Yeah, please go ahead. Garrett's going to be talking about
posters. So, how many of you saw my data visualization talk, whenever that was? So, quite a few of you. How many of you have had to make posters and done poster sessions? Okay, a lot less. All right, that's interesting. Yeah, so posters are quite a mixture of things. Posters are a wonderful opportunity to present your work and to talk really directly with people from a lot of different levels. So at a poster, if you give a talk, it's great. You get up in front of a lot of people, you present your stuff, there'll be some questions. In a poster session, you write down with everybody. And so you'll be talking to professors and researchers and students and like people from all different levels. They'll ask you questions, you get to ask them questions, learn about things. So it's a wonderful opportunity to interact and show people your work. It's also very difficult because it combines a lot of different things. It combines storytelling and data visualization and graphic design and lots of these different things. And I always found it quite challenging to put that together in a way that I felt like looked really good and did a good job of communicating. So because I had to do this a lot and I wasn't trained in it, I feel passionate about trying to help other people make their posters better. So what do good posters have? Good posters have a focused, obvious, and short story. People are not going to be engaging with your poster for more than a few minutes. So you can't tell them everything about what you've done. It needs to be shorter than that. That story needs to be clear from far away, and that's partly because of the setup of a poster session. So at some poster sessions, there might be hundreds of posters around on boards. People are wandering around with their snacks and their drinks, and they're trying to decide which of the posters are interesting enough to me to spend the energy of reading it, of going up and talking to someone. For me, that takes a lot of energy, and so you want to draw people in from far away with telling them your story, not just through the titles, but through other elements on your poster. You're going to need to have limited text, just because people aren't going to be willing to read lots and lots of paragraphs in that time. That's going to mean cutting some of it out and using graphics and images instead of the text in some cases. And then the whole thing needs to have a clear organization and flow so that people know how to read it. It looks professional. Sometimes when people look at your posters, this is the impression they're getting for whether to give you jobs or grant money or all of these things. So the whole thing needs to look clean and professional and communicate well. Now, this is an example of what I think is a good poster. It's fairly wordy, but Brenda is a good scientist, a good designer. You look at this, it looks professional. She hasn't used too many colors. She's got some data visualization. Her graphics look nice. She's got kind of motivation and takeaway sections on here. So I think this is a really nice poster. Unfortunately, there's a lot of ways you can go wrong with your poster. Bad posters might have an incoherent story, too much text, too much detail. The text could be too small, patterns behind the text making it hard to read. Lines of text that are too long so our eye doesn't know where to jump back to the next line. Generic section titles, no white space, poor graphics, too many colors, no focal points or hierarchy of information, and maybe emphasis on less important elements. This is an example of what I think is a pretty challenging poster to look at. This is a little tough. You look at it, there's a lot going on. It's very busy. There's lots of colors. It's hard for my eye to know where to go. A lot of this text looks kind of squished for some reason. There's hardly any white space here, so it feels a little claustrophobic to me. So it's nothing against the people that did this, but it's not that uncommon to see posters when you go to a poster session that aren't great. There's a lot of bad posters out there. And what I want you to take away from this today is that I think you can make a pretty good poster by just avoiding some of the pitfalls that people fall into and having a few principles in your mind, it doesn't have to be the most inventive, the best poster ever. I think as long as it's clear, it communicates well, it just doesn't have some of these problem areas, you are going to be just fine, and you're going to actually stand out amongst the other posters just because there's going to be a lot of them. Like, the bar is really low. There's going to be a lot of posters that are a big mess, okay? This is kind of my suggestions, the way I tend to do posters. I had a bit.ly link at the beginning. I'll repeat it at the end. I'll pass it along to the organizers. At that bit.ly link is a folder that has a PDF of these slides, plus it has this PowerPoint document that has kind of this poster plus some general guidelines and stuff in it. So you'll have that as resources. So this is kind of my suggestion for how I do posters. This is a group of 6 sociology senior thesis students that kind of listened to how I do things. They took their own subject areas, their own personal style. They wanted to match their personality. But you look at these, and I think they did an incredible job. They all communicate well. You can see that there's some similarities among them, but it's not like your posters are all going to turn out the same. There's lots of ways that you can take it for your work, for your personality, while still keeping within these areas where you're going to communicate clearly. So let's go through these kind of guidelines one by one. Posters should tell a specific short story. Again, that is not going to be all of the work you did. It's just going to be a subset of it. And you need to use kind of shorter, punchier text just so people don't have to read lots of paragraphs and they can take in the main ideas more quickly. So I tend to say, like, maybe only 300 to 500 words for the entire poster. Now, if you count the words, that may be unrealistic. Like, if you take your PowerPoint document, you can go to the file section in the info and it can tell you in the statistics how many words you have. This is not very many, but I want you to kind of shoot for that. This poster here is an example where, again, Simone is a really good scientist, a great designer. She brought me this poster draft, and I read through it. I'm like, it's beautiful. It would work well for like a pamphlet where someone had more time to sit down with it because it explains things in detail. There's repetitions between these different sections. So to make it punchier, she had to go back and try to tighten this up a little bit. I love this quote from Cliff Long, who's the head of an infographics design company. People get wrapped up in the process, but they confuse the depth of detail that they had to go through with the amount of detail other people are willing to go through to get the information. You know a lot of things. You have worked hard. Not everybody is going to be as interested or have the time and energy to go into all that detail that you could go into. And so you have to really consider that in cutting down your story. Now, deciding on that story is really tough. It's hard to figure that out. What I like to do is go through a process that I learned from Michael Bond, who talks about effective presentation design. Now I use this technique for presentations, for posters, for teaching I'm trying to do. He says, take regular size square Post-it notes and a regular size Sharpie. So you can't write too much on each Post-it. First, go through a brainstorming phase where you write down all the different ideas and pieces of information you would love to get across. So this piece of background info, this result, this, and you put them each on one Post-it. You have this big cloud of Post-its. You don't edit yourself at first. Just like, what would I love to tell people about if I had all the time and the space in the world? Then you go back to that and you look and you say, okay, if people are only going to look at this for, 2 to 5 minutes, which subset of these Post-its is a story that I could tell that would be engaging and interesting? And so you start to pull those aside. You put your other ones, your extra ones, over in another area. You can start arranging these in space. Okay, maybe I would tell it in this order. You could have a different color Post-it for some visuals that might go along with some of the ideas. That way, you're working out your ideas. You're working out your story, partly to save yourself work, because if you decide on what your story is and which details are really important to, which details do I need to tell that story, then you don't have to prepare everything, all the different text, all the different figures. You're just preparing what you need. This is an example when I was teaching a 4-day workshop. Each day had 4 different sections in it, trying to figure out, okay, what can I fit in here? What would go with what? You can see some things are over on the side. It really works as a nice flexible way to get yourself into your story before you start putting things into PowerPoint. So we want to reduce some of the text. We're going to try to cut things down and make them punchy bullet points instead of paragraphs. The other thing we can do, or one of the other things we can do to get rid of text, is to replace some of it with visuals like diagrams. So in this poster draft, this is just one of the panels in Catherine's poster draft. I love it. She's got a data visualization. She's got a nice diagram. But, this is in her methods. I'm like reading through all of this bulleted text. And I was asking her, okay, what percentage of the people that are going to be in this audience, what percentage of the people are going to want to know all of these details? If the answer to that is 5 or 10% of the people, you're making a mistake. I think you need to tune your poster to what do 80% of the people want to know? How much detail do they want? Because the people that don't want all of this detail, they're not going to read through all these things and just absorb the stuff they want. They might look at it and be like, whoa, okay, that's a little too much. We'll just skip it. They'll start reading. They'll get bogged down. They won't get to the end and you'll lose them. So you want to be designing your poster for the 80% of the people, which looks maybe a little bit more like this, where she kept her data visualization, she kept a couple of important pieces of information and almost made it into a diagram, simplified her mouse diagram. Now this gives people just the important details. People can ask for other details. You can have a handout to give them. You can have a QR code that leads them to a manuscript or more information or supplementary figures, all that, but then this keeps more of the audience engaged. When you're making your diagrams, if you start out directly in PowerPoint, trying to, as an example of where you might make a diagram, if you start directly in PowerPoint, it constrains your creativity. And everything ends up looking kind of the same. Like this was a draft for a paper where they wanted a figure that, obviously has multiple diagrams in it and a bunch of text, but they wanted it to be something where people could take it and they would use it as a reference. This was a big policy change. They wanted to advertise. They had like initial stages and then final stages, but these were on 2 different pages in their diagram. You can see this is how all of our kind of first drafts tend to look. It's default kind of PowerPoint ellipses and arrows and stuff. What I really want to encourage you to do is when you're thinking about diagrams, start by sketching. Start on pencil and paper, whiteboard, tablet, whatever you're comfortable with. Sketching allows you to try out ideas, fail, and try out other ones quickly. So in 15 minutes, I could maybe do 3 different versions of the layout of this diagram. And, in 15 minutes, I barely would have gotten a few elements on the page in PowerPoint, okay? So you start with sketching. Here, I'm like, okay, can I fit this all on one page? How can I compare the first section to the last section directly? So playing around with ideas. And then once you've done your sketching, all you're using the software for is to render that idea. So in this case, I ended up rendering it with both a combination of Adobe Illustrator and then I put it all in PowerPoint. So there will be things that like, okay, in my sketch, I drew this like swooshy arrow and I don't know how to do a swooshy arrow in PowerPoint. That's when you get in touch with me and you're like, Eric, how can I do a swooshy arrow? Because when I do just a regular block arrow, it looks fine, but it looks like everybody else's thing. And in my sketch, I had a swooshy arrow. Okay, so I then help you figure out how to make swooshy arrows, and you're just using the software to kind of render that idea rather than trying to come up with it. Now, when I'm starting from scratch, if I have the flexibility, I do tend to use Adobe Illustrator to do my diagrams. Not everybody has access to it. Students that do have free access to the Adobe Creative Cloud, not everyone has access, but if you do, it has some advantages over PowerPoint. I think diagrams look a little more designed if they have curved lines in them, and that you can do curved lines in PowerPoint. It's just the control is not quite the same. You can do these things like you select an object and it'll automatically select all the objects that have the same fill color or stroke or things like that. Alignment is a little easier. The main thing I like is that you can take certain elements and put them on different layers. So I get really frustrated when I'm doing a diagram and I'm, say, trying to edit this text, but I keep accidentally selecting this curved line here. Okay, so what I can do with PowerPoint or with Illustrator, like put all the text on one layer, lock it while I'm trying to edit the other things, just a little more flexible. If you want to get started with Illustrator, do a lot of stuff. You only need a small subset of it to do diagrams. I have a workshop video where I help you learn some of the basics to get started with Illustrator. But really, PowerPoint works just fine for diagrams. This one, as Lee's PI wanted him to do this diagram in PowerPoint. And you can see it's just, it's a combination of lines and colored shapes and text. Like PowerPoint works just fine for that. I also have a workshop video on kind of playing around with graphics, creating graphics from scratch, doing alignment things with PowerPoint if you want to get a little bit better at those skills. And then BioRender is great. I don't know how many of you might use BioRender for your diagrams. It has a lot of really professional looking elements in it. So that works fine as long as the elements that you need are there. It's kind of hard to create your own stuff that matches the quality of what's in there. So I've had people run into that problem. And then just know that the free version, it only has low resolution export. So for posters, it won't have enough pixels to get big enough to look clear. And then you don't have permission to publish in journals with the free version. So you need to get a subscription for a while and then use that. Yeah.
Do students have access to that?
No, I think it's a separate thing. I think you just have to, pay for the subscription, unfortunately.
Is there anything that the free version is that you would suggest people use it for? Like
like for talks and stuff, it works well.
Okay.
Like that's great.
Like a PowerPoint slide.
Yeah, like a PowerPoint. Well, it'll have enough resolution for that. It's not being published. You don't have to worry about licensing things. And then I've known professors who will just get a license for a while they're creating the figure, and I think that works fine. Like I don't think there's anything to stop you from getting that license for a month and paying the $35 and developing your graphic and then just using that. It seems fine. The other kind of graphics that people might use are icons. Sometimes they'll add visual interest. They might help people kind of understand what different sections are. The main things with icons is some are built into PowerPoint, so you can look through what they have. But I tend to go to something called the Noun Project. So it's online. You can then search for any term, pregnancy, conflict, whatever you're studying. See whether designers have come up with icons that kind of cover that. The main thing there is you want to have, if you have multiple icons, you want them all to have about the same amount of detail. So don't have some with really fine lines, some are big, thick, chunky lines. If I can find an icon that has been designed as part of a set by the same designer, that's really handy because then the doctor and the hospital both, kind of look the same because they were designed as part of the same set. A lot of you heard I talked about this already, but another way to get rid of text is by replacing it with data visualizations. Some of this stuff you have already seen already, but it's just a short section of basic principles that try to keep them in mind as you're trying to tell your stories with your data. So you absolutely want to avoid distorting people's perceptions of the data. So one way that commonly happen is something like a bar chart, where we're encoding the values in the data, not by where the bars end, but it's the length of the bars that we end up seeing. But here you can see the bar chart doesn't go to 0, it starts at 25. So the second bar looks 7 times bigger than the second one, when really that's not how it is. If we start at 0, we see the correct proportions. If you need to zoom in on the data range, just use individual symbols or lines, something like that. Bars, it'll get distorted. Try to avoid legends when you can, because you look at a chart like this, and it looks pretty clear. We're used to seeing legends when we want different colors for each of our categories. But as you try to stare at this and understand like which ones were rising, which ones are falling, your eye has to jump back and forth between the legend and the chart, and that extra effort makes it harder for you to absorb the story. Now, it would have helped if, and I purposely did this in a bad way, the default way here was to order the categories alphabetically. And that means that the legend is in a different order than the lines are. So if I have a legend, at least try to put the legend elements in the same order as maybe where the lines end. Directly label your pie charts. Here you can see though, it wasn't that hard to add the data labels, a lot more clear and quick for people to absorb what the trends are, pay attention to my story, not be jumping back and forth. Again, you've seen this before, but try to use color, not just to label your categories, but to really punch your story so people know which elements to pay attention to, and then the rest of the bars here are kind of the context for the comparisons I'm making, and I would typically color those in light gray. This technique that we talked about last time of using a darker, more vibrant color for the things you want people to pay attention to, and then something like light gray for the rest, so that they know more clearly what the story is, and then really designing for that story. Figure out with each of your figures, why do you have it there? What's the job it's supposed to do? What's it supposed to communicate? What's the story it's trying to tell? And then don't just leave it kind of generic. Try to change the design to really make that story clear, often by adding annotations, but it could be by changing the type of chart or the colors, things like that, to make that story clear, rather than just having kind of what you would consider kind of a raw version of the data up there. This section is one that for me made a huge difference in figuring out how to make my posters decent. I've never had trouble knowing how to paste the elements into PowerPoint. Like, that part is I can kind of paste elements in. It's hard to know how to fit things. Of course, that's a lot of work, but I would get done with that first draft, and I could tell it wasn't great. But I didn't know what things should I be thinking about that might help me incrementally make this poster better and communicate better and look better. Okay? So I happened upon this book in the public library years and years ago called The Non-Designer's Design Book. And in it, she's talking about page layout, like for magazines and stuff, but the principles are exactly the same for figures and posters and slides. These principles apply to all of this. They are not revolutionary. You're not going to be super surprised by any of them. It's basically things that could help take you from maybe this first draft on the left to this one on the right that I think is stronger. What do you folks see as differences between the left and the right that makes the right one more effective? Yeah.
Good design being a lot bigger, just makes it stand out more.
Yeah, the contrast of that title design, here the title is a little bit bigger than the rest, but not a lot bigger. Punching that contrast helps draw our attention, make it clearer. Good. What else?
Replace the numbers with spacing.
Yeah, that's in the left here. They have this thing. Good design is as easy as 1, 2, 3, and then they label 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's kind of cute. but it sort of feels like a kid's book, you know? And so I like this change where instead of numbering it, they went good design is as easy as, and then you have the 3 principles, and then with the way they've done the spacing, you can tell that it's 3 things. You don't need them numbered. Good. Couple more things. There's a bunch of differences here. Yeah.
I didn't even notice really that it was bolded before. And
Yeah.
so I saw this one, and I feel like the size difference.
Yeah, this is a trap that we can all fall into with fonts, colors, lots of things. The difference here between the bold and the regular weight is really not that big, and it's not that noticeable. She says something in the book that is, if you're going to make a contrast between 2 things, font size, weight, color, make it big enough so that people don't think it's a mistake. Make it a big enough contrast, a big enough difference. Here, it's hard to notice. Here, really, that weight, the boldness versus the lighter ones, much more, it draws our eye more, and it doesn't blend in as much like this. Anything else? Yeah.
I like how in the second one, they left spaces between the 3, like when left the 1 and 3, they're kind of clustered together.
Yeah, it's just like a big blob of text here. And even though they're numbered, our eyes don't see that separation. By putting this white space here, it's super clear that it's 3 points. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Indentation, like one straight.
Yeah, the straight here looks really nice. It groups these things together. Multi-line centered text. Every line starts at a different point. It's slower to read this way and more uncomfortable to read. Less aligned, cleaner, easier to read. Yeah.
I see this a lot on resumes. Some people will do, what's it called? Not a
Oh, yeah, fully justified on both sides. Yeah.
Is there, because for me visually, it's hard to read when words are different spaces from each other. I'm trying to find a way to explain why to just do left align.
Yeah, it's
like, is there a design principle that has anything to do with that?
I think it's more what you're saying. Unfortunately, that one is culturally dependent. So
Yeah.
I've had, especially in my experience, the few students that have mentioned it have all been Chinese students that it's just culturally, like it's, for them in particular at least, having those straight sides on both sides of the text that just looks better, they feel like it's better. So the way I explain it is just, consider it's just something about English in the US. Like when people that are used to reading English in the US look at this, we're fine having, and I'll show an example of this in a few minutes, having that ragged right edge that isn't aligned is just fine. The gaps between the words are considered ugly and they make the text slower to read. It's harder to read the text quickly when there's a variation in spacing between the words. So I try to get people to left align. Yeah.
To that, InDesign handles that better.
Yeah.
InDesign will do justify text, but it knows where to break a word. So the spacing is similar.
So
Yeah,
this is like resume, right? So if it's a resume and you've got like a solid inch before the end, it'll like justify it. So that's
Yeah, but so nobody is going to be using InDesign though is the problem.
I think it works pretty well for.
Oh, it works great. No, it's a wonderful.
No one's even spent for the resume.
Yes, I know you are, and that's wonderful. And I think if people learn how to use InDesign, it's an awesome piece of software that is built for professional page layout. It has a really sophisticated type engine, just like you're saying. It can change not only the spacing between the words, but the spacing between the letters. It can slightly distort the letters themselves so that you end up getting a much more even distribution, exactly like you're saying. The problem is that it's a super low percentage of people that are going to be using that. And PowerPoint and Microsoft Word and stuff don't have sophisticated type engines in them. So, yeah.
But yeah, someone points them to InDesign if that's their preference. To have the like good.
Yeah.
So if you have
a template, then it's easy to modify things.
Yeah, it's a great piece of software. Yeah, so it's not too hard to see the differences here. You know, they took out this border that really isn't necessary because the edge of the page is right there and it looks a little old fashioned. They changed the font from this, you know, what looks to me like Times New Roman, which at the time the book was written was the default for Microsoft Word. And so everybody got kind of used to, they saw this and it looked like everybody's default, you know, letter that they start writing. It also, I tend to advise people, this is a soft advice, but I tend to advise people to use sans serif fonts. So serifs are the little pointy feet on the ends of the characters. Ones without that are called sans serif, the French word sans meaning without. Sans serif fonts they look more modern, partly because they were developed more recently. Okay, so if you are doing modern kind of cutting edge work, I think it looks a little more modern now. There are definitely exceptions. I saw an engineering presentation the other day that was designed impeccably. It looked beautiful. And the woman used, you know, these serif fonts and stuff. So if you know what you're doing, if you really love that feel and stuff, I love a lot of serif fonts, but I tend to tell people just use sans serif for more modern work. Color draws our eye more. So there's a bunch of things that they've changed. We're going to give these things names. So I think it helps when you name things, it helps you kind of cycle through them and try to identify what might be the problems with my poster graph. So we're going to talk about proximity, alignment, repetition, and contrast. Proximity is the first one, and it's basically just grouping related items together in space and making more space between those items. So instead of like a random layout of information, which, you know, we can read, we are faster and it kind of conceptually groups things in our mind when you group things spatially. So we take this in, we see, you know, the company and the name, we group that together in our minds conceptually, we group the address and phone number, kind of chunk those pieces of information. Notice, though, that you can't create this proximity between things without creating extra space between other items, other groups, between the edges of the page. This is one of the reasons we need white space. You need some white space just so people understand like the divisions between your sections, so it doesn't feel super tight and claustrophobic, but it's also so that we can read it more quickly. And it comes in, this is kind of like that card example that we saw at the beginning, comes in some funny areas like the default bulleted text in PowerPoint looks like this. Now, it's fine, we can read it, but what my brain sees at a really quick glance is 3 dots and one big chunk of text. Again, I understand what it is, but the problem here is that there's not enough space between the bullet points. The space between the bullet points is the same as the line spacing within a bullet, and then there's too much space between the bullet character and the text there, so our eyes don't group that together. Now to fix this, I don't want you to just add an extra carriage return, between your bullet points, because it's hard to adjust that spacing. You have to select every character in between bullets, change the font size, it's very slow. I want you to fix both of these problems through the paragraph formatting in PowerPoint. Okay, the space between the bullet and the text is this, the before text for indentation, and it has to be matched by this hanging. So I just click both of them down from, you know, I don't know what it starts at, 0.5 down to 0.2 or something. You click that down, and then you add the extra space between the paragraphs, between the bullet points, with either some before or after spacing. Now, unfortunately, PowerPoint's not going to give you a preview of what it looks like until you hit OK, and then you're like, oh, I need it to be a little bit more, a little bit less. You open it back up again, you change it, you hit OK, you go out, but it changed. You can get it to go from this to this. It's not a huge change, okay? But the changes you are going to make from your initial draft to something that looks a lot better, cleaner, easier to read, more effective, may end up being just a bunch of small changes like this. And so consistency in this and the spacing, so now I just quickly see 3 bullet points. Second principle, that was proximity. Second principle is alignment. She makes a strong statement that nothing should be placed on the page arbitrarily. Everything should align with something because it helps unify the page. Like you see here, even this attribution I have at the bottom is aligned with both the cards and this text, and it helps create kind of an artificial boundary there. Centered text is at least aligned, but centered looks a little bit more placid, it looks kind of pleasant. We use it for wedding invitations because it looks pretty and nice. It's going to be stronger, more professional looking if you right or left align your text. Now, you'll see in a minute, my advice is going to be left align most of your text. If you have numbers in a table, you want to right align those. Be nice if all the decimal places are lined up, but basically right align numbers, left align text. If you have a header in a table that's over a column of numbers, right align that also so it lines up with the numbers. Okay, but everything should be lined up with something. The third principle is repetition. It's basically just consistency in your formatting, but pushed a little further. So you see here, got one format for the title, that's fine, but then the main headers have one font size, subheaders have a different one, and that's consistent. Body text is all the same size. It helps us understand the structure of what we're reading much more quickly. It works on diagrams as well. I've got 3 different colored lines here, but we don't see them as 3 completely different things because they all have the same sort of rounded rectangles as labels. Once we understand that these are headers for each of these sections, their format is the same, the alignment's the same, so we understand what all of them are, that repetition helps us read things more quickly and creates kind of a unified visual interest. The last one is contrast. And this contrast helps both create some interest and it sets what on the page we notice first. We create contrast through the use of what we call pre-attentive visual attributes. Now, in my visualization talk, I may have mentioned this, we also use pre-attentive visual attributes to create our data visualizations. But the pre-attentive part means we don't have to scan manually through all of these gray squares to find this black circle. In a fraction of a second, we notice those differences in weight or position or color or orientation. So we're going to use this to our advantage, some of which is just to create some visual interest. So I think almost all of us, our eyes are going to be drawn to that one on the right more than the one on the left. And it's just because they have not just been consistent with their fonts, they have created more contrast that helps draw our eyes in there. We also want to use contrast to create what we call a visual hierarchy. So on your poster, in every figure, you want to help control what gets noticed first. Like here, of course, the thing that we all notice first is this big word glossary. It's huge, okay? The next level down in this hierarchy is this colored text. It's a lot smaller, but it's colored. It kind of punches forward. So we notice that. So we're controlling people's eyes. We draw them in with a huge thing. We give them these pieces of information. Then there's even a lower level. This is just for the people that are really interested in all the details. There is this information about calf height, X height, baseline. Same with your poster. You want some things to be toned down because not everyone's interested in all the details. The problem is going to be that you are going to feel like, okay, you know, what's the most important? You're going to try to make some decisions. Okay, I've got my poster. Of course, you know, the title is important, so I'm going to put it big and at the top. Yeah, that's good. Well, okay, let's see. Got some kind of motivation, background information. You know, if people don't understand that, they're not really going to understand why I did things or what my results were, so that's important. Well, you know, the methods are important. That's what I spend a lot of time on for reproducibility in science. Like, methods are important. Well, of course, you know, results. Results are really important. So I want to highlight that. Well, but it's not just the results, like the conclusions, what I draw from the results. That's really important. Everything is going to feel important. Okay? But if you try to highlight everything, this is what you get. Okay, you get a big shouty mess that people, it's hard to stand in front of, it's hard to know what to look at. So your challenge is going to be deciding which things to de-emphasize. Of course, the most important things, you want bigger, more central, but which things can you tone down, make smaller, maybe even get rid of to create that hierarchy so not everything is shouting at the same level. Now this leads very naturally into posters should be comfortable to read. You know, if I'm standing in front of this thing, it's going to be kind of painful and I'm not going to want to sit there long enough to understand the story, okay? So one of the ways that you can make things comfortable or not is through color. And if you look at professional designs, one thing that I've noticed is professional designers tend to use more muted colors. They don't use really pure bright colors all the time. In these three infographics that were kind of made to go as a set, you notice that there's not too many colors, and each one, like the main highlight color is there, but then there's different kind of tints of that, different lighter versions of that, and then there's hardly any pure black in any of these. The default for your text and a lot of your lines and things like that is going to be pure black. Note that you can tone things down to different levels of gray and it'll look more professional. It'll help create that hierarchy. If you look at Alice Kitterman's illustrations for the science journals, you know, she's only got two main colors. They're very muted and then grays, and this just looks very well designed. It looks professional, and it is partly through the use of her color. Now, like I talked about in the visualization talk, I do rely on the Duke branding guides for my colors, okay? I don't remember if I went through all of this, but you know, you've got your two main Duke blues, then you've got your extended palette that has some highlight colors, more muted colors, background elements. The combination of these is what helps me create that hierarchy. I make sure I have elements that are using these colors and not just these bright ones. And posters at Duke are notorious for, I don't know what. Like, I swear 95% of the posters are blue and white. You go to, especially on the med side, you know, you go to a Duke poster session and it's just a sea of blue and white. And I swear, if you just use some of these other colors, your poster is going to stand out and people are going to notice it because it's not just blue and white. So really fight that. Fight that hard. This is a part I don't remember if I talked about before. Maybe all of you know this, how to use it, but to use these colors, you grab this hex code, these combinations of they tell how much red, green, and blue is in each of the colors. It just uses hexadecimal rather than decimal 0 through 9, hexadecimal 0 through 9 plus A, B, C, D, E, F, base 16. You take whatever your shape, your font, you go to the more colors section, you go to the RGB section, you paste it in here, that hex code, and you'll get the new color once you hit OK. Now, when I tend to use this copper color from the top of this guide for my headers. And when I use it in text, it often looks a little bit light. Thin lines of color look lighter than thick blocks or sections. All you have to do to make a darker version of a color, don't try to slide things around in the RGB sliders. Go to the HSV, which is hue, saturation, and brightness. Hue is the main base color. Saturation is how gray or vivid it is. Brightness is just how light or dark. So all you have to do is like slide the brightness down a little bit. It's still basically the same color. It's just a little darker version. It'll go with the rest. And then this brings up, because that's with text, text happens to be really sensitive to contrast. Okay? You're all pretty young. Your eyes might still be a lot better than my older eyes. You're giving a talk. You don't know what the projectors are going to be like. Every room has different amounts of ambient light. Your poster, I've had to sit my poster poster in sections where like the lights are here and here, but my poster is in the dark. Okay, so go with really light on really dark or really dark on really light, get into this middle ground and it becomes hard to see. Like on some projectors, I can read this, and some I can't. Once you get patterns behind your text, it becomes really hard to read. So just avoid that. You know, you don't want to be in this sort of situation here trying to explain to people where they should go during the fire drill, or if there's a fire in the library. It's hard to pick this out. Those patterns behind the text make it hard to read. When you're picking your fonts, we've already covered a little bit of these things, but I'm going to go over it again. Just use one font or one type family for the whole poster. Some designers are good enough, they know what fonts go with each other. I don't. I do not recommend that people try to do that. So just like here, this happens to be Myriad Pro, which used to be the default in the Adobe products. And you can see it has a big variety of ways and styles, but any professional font that you're using will have regular italic, bold, and bold italic. That is enough variation when you combine it with different sizes and colors, things like that. You don't need multiple fonts. Avoid all capitals. It's just slower for us to read. If it's one or two words, that's fine, but we use the ups and downs of the lowercase to read more quickly. Then, like we were talking about, left align most of your text, right align most of your your numbers. So this is what we're talking about with fully justified. Again, just because PowerPoint doesn't have as good a type engine as InDesign, we get these white gaps, especially with narrow columns. It makes it super hard to read. Center text, every line starts at a different place. We're really fine in the US with English, left align, ragged right edge. I would just do that. And then keep your text large. Like on a poster, you want it readable from like 4 feet away. I would stay above like 22, 24 point font for the main body text. If a few little things or your references are smaller, okay, that's fine. But that's a good bottom side. And then the lines being short, again, if we're reading a really long line of text, like I've seen people put an introduction like spanning the whole poster, and when the lines get long, our eye doesn't know where to jump to for the next line. So 45 to 75 characters is a good kind of general rule. If it gets longer than that, just break it into multiple columns, do some other solution. And then finally, thing that I was talking about, posters should have a clear message from far away. There are a couple issues here. You know, I talked about people wandering around. You want to draw them in with your story. You don't want to hide the details, because I swear, every person that I talk to about posters, if I tell them, oh, tell me the 30-second, like really short version of your poster, they have a really interesting story to tell. All of you have interesting stories to tell. Don't just put your title. Have other things on your poster that actually give away the story. Don't try to set it up like a murder mystery where you don't want to give away what the bottom line is. Make it clear from far away. That's partly because it draws people in. It's also because, oh, now I forget his name, but this guy came up with a format for posters called Better Posters, where the center section of the poster has a great big takeaway message on it. We can talk more about that if you want, but his assertion was, and I totally agree, that scientific posters are broken. Most poster sessions you go to, you're there because you want to kind of learn what's going on in the field, or what happened during a summer program or something. If you look around, most people leave the poster session hardly knowing anything about what was going on in the field, in that summer session, because each poster takes a lot of work to get there and figure out what's the takeaway message, what were they looking at, what did they find. So if you can come up with a really clear takeaway message and make it big, it'll also let people know what's going on in the field. Like, we're leaving these poster sessions not understanding what's going on in the field, what the cutting edge is. Okay? Newspapers are great at this. You look at the print paper, or you look at the website, you can quickly scan through and know kind of what's going on in the world, okay? The main title draws you in. If you're interested in that, they'll have like subtitles that give you slightly more information, and then they put the most important information in the story right up at the top so that people can get it, and then if they're interested in all the details, then they can read the whole story, but they're realistic. They know not everybody wants all the details. You need to be that way with your posters too. This magazine, hyper-personalized medicine. Okay, that might draw me in, but then they have more big stuff. Novel drugs are being designed to treat unique genetic mutations. They have this section, why it matters, key players, availability. They draw people in, giving away that information. So if you have your poster, maybe make a big section that's about the motivation. You know, for this, providing thesis support for undergrads, this is the motivation. Students start writing a thesis, but don't always complete it. Okay, that might draw some people in. You know, okay, that doesn't sound great. What did they find? Undergraduates receiving integrated academic and advising support show increased rates of thesis completion. Okay, some people, that's going to be enough info. That's fine. They see your name. They know what you did. Other people, they're going to like, oh, what's the details of that? They want to see the details. They want to talk to you about it. That's how you draw them in. Now, your headers on your sections, hopefully that will tell part of your story, not just the title. So here it's like a certain drug, a growth factor, a peptide. Okay, that sort of identifies things, but it doesn't draw me in like some extra info. This growth factor recently identified important metabolic hormone. This peptide enhances insulin secretion in the pancreas. Okay, that lets me know a bit more what it's about. This panel, she's got a good active title here. Dual agonist outperforms GLP-1 receptor agonist. Yeah, this thing outperformed another thing. That's telling something. But as I moved from that title down into each of these charts, I got confused for a minute. I was like, okay, what am I looking at? Is high good? Is low good? Once I read the bulleted text, I understood more. Okay, but I had that moment of confusion for a while. Okay, and this won't happen with everybody, but for me, I have unfortunately based too much of my self-esteem on my intelligence as I've grown up. So when I get confused by a chart or some game that someone's trying to teach me and I don't understand it, or I can't solve a puzzle, like, I thought you were supposed to be smart, you know, why are you getting confused? That moment of confusion makes me feel bad, okay? If it's with a poster, I might also then, to protect myself, transfer that around and start feeling bad about you because you're the ones that confused me. Okay? We want to avoid all of this sort of mess. What do we want instead? I think we all love that joy of discovery. We love learning new things. We love that joy of discovery. We want to create an experience more like that. So if you put a title above each of your figures, I think you'd get more of that. So this treated group responds to glucose spike more efficiently than X molar dose of this. And then we look at it. It results in significantly lower body weights compared to this other treatment. Now we move down into the chart, kind of discovering along with the storyteller, and that feels really good. So, I know I threw a lot at you there, but let's sum it up. Posters should tell a single short story. You're going to have to make choices on that. That's not everything you did. It's some subset that's going to be absorbable within a few minutes. This is not the same as a manuscript. This is not the same as a long talk. A poster is a different sort of product for a different goal. That story should be obvious from far away. You're going to try to do that through using active headers that tell your story. You're going to create this visual hierarchy using contrast so people know what to look at first, and there's some things that are important, some that are less important. Minimize the text. Just because people aren't going to be willing to read a lot, that means cutting some of it down, converting some to visuals. Leave white space so it's comfortable to stand in front of, people understand the structure, things are grouped properly, and then limit the colors and the fonts just so it looks tight and professional and your alignment's good, all these things. It reflects, when people see a tight, professional looking poster, they end up feeling like, oh, this is a scientist who I would trust. I trust their results. I would trust to give them money or hire them because they pay attention to details. They look professional. It ends up having an impression on people. Now, I know we're running over. Is it okay if I go into your time a little bit to go through a poster report? I know you're going to show some different versions.
Sure, take my posters.
Okay, we can do that too. But what I'm going to do here is show you a draft poster from a student who was trying to prepare for a poster session for the funders of her summer research experience. So she wanted to tell them what she learned, what she worked on. You're going to see this is a pretty rough draft. There are some blank sections that she hasn't even filled in yet. But this is actually a good time to get feedback where you figured out kind of what your story is. You've got a fair amount of elements. But if you put 40 hours in tweaking every little element, aligning everything, and then get feedback, you're not going to be willing to make changes because you already put in too much work. Okay, so show each other, show other people, what do you see, what's, and we'll go through this in the way that I run this with people in groups when it's, sometimes it's their posters. We're going to start with what do you like? What do you think is working well? What is she just not make silly mistakes on? Okay, so we start with the positives because sometimes someone put 10 hours into that first poster draft. Okay. I also want you to get good at recognizing good things so you can start using it in your posters. Okay. Then we'll switch over to what's not working as well as it could be. What are some ideas that you might try to make it more effective? And often I don't know whether those ideas are going to work better until I try them. And so I tend to just duplicate my slide, start making some of those changes, then I can flip back and forth. Like, oh, do I like it better or don't? I can grab, if I deleted things, I can grab elements from my old versions of the posters, so I end up having a bunch of versions in my PowerPoint file. Okay? So, let's look at this together. Take a minute to look at it. Tell me, what do you like about it? Or what do you think is perfectly fine with it? Yeah, there's plenty of white space. The sections aren't just totally crammed together. There's some white space between the sections. Good. What else?
The discussion part.
Yeah, the discussion is empty. Future corrections are just an outline right now because she's just not totally done with her draft. But yeah, what do you like about it? Yeah.
They have different sections and I know exactly what you said.
Okay, so separate sections, it's really clear what each one is about. It's important that people understand our organization, they understand the flow of how to read it. She's used a very classic kind of columns that go from left to right. Again, you don't have to be the most innovative person in the world. Sometimes the classic layout works fine, especially if it's a crowded poster session. People might have to like read and shuffle sideways and read and shuffle sideways, so it worked fine. Yeah, a couple more things that are good. Yeah.
I like that the methods is like not like full of words.
Okay.
It looks cleaner.
Yeah, the methods, it looks a little lighter. She's tried to put arrows instead of just making a list. She's tried something a little bit different, and that kind of attracts our eye. Yeah, good. Yeah.
I like that the title it's not super simple, but it just makes sense. And then if there's a word in there that people might not know in the background, portion which is at the very start, she talks about what exactly it is.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, good. So making,
with the fonts, with the headers, really like content.
Yeah, she's using the same colors, she's using the same font size for all the headers, got that repetition, the consistency. I think most of the body text is a consistent size. There might be a little variation that we'd have to address, but yeah, she's not using too many colors. It's not a big shouty rainbow. She's got data visualization. She's got some images that draw our attention. She's got a diagram in there. She's not just using all words. You know, there's a lot of stuff that's just fine about this. It's a good starting point. What do people see here that they think isn't as strong as it could be, and what might you try? And then I'll show you like a couple variations. I'll show you one slight variation that I made, and I'll show you her final version so you can see. Yeah.
I can't really understand the figure in the background. It's tiny.
Yeah, this diagram, you know, if it's important enough to be there, people need to be able to read it. It looks really underemphasized, and it looks impossible to read with how tiny. Yeah.
So the results figure as well, the y-axis not really clear.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of like, somehow the text from the label on the y-axis got over onto the numbers. So yeah, we need to fix that. Good. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's fine to have a whole paragraph there, but it's not consistent with style the rest. I think she might limit the text.
Okay.
Without the rest.
So some of the other text is more limited, but this is a huge paragraph.
Yeah, I think that really
Yeah.
stands out.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, this is like a big paragraph where the other stuff isn't big paragraphs. These are also very largely sized. Like her acknowledgements and references just don't need to be, these can be kind of tiny. You know, these are not the most important. As long as they're there, like, that's good. You don't always need references. It depends on the poster. But yeah, she could make this a lot smaller. Yeah.
In the header line, look for, like, there's only two colors, right? It's white and blue.
Yeah, yeah.
But they're not centered in the vertical space of each of those bars.
Yeah.
The reference discussions are at the top of that blue bar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think we'd have to look at it in detail too, whether, so there's two things that happen. Yeah, so within this shape, she has, it's probably like top aligned, and then there's it may be even inconsistent amount of like padding inside of those boxes. So it'd be nice if those were centered. You really want to check if you have boxes like this, if they're all exactly the same height. I see a lot of posters where there's just slight variations in how high these things are. If you click on an element, you can go to like shape format, I think it is, and it'll tell you the dimensions, so you can type in a different dimension. So you can just put like 1.2 inches or whatever, and it'll make it the same size as the rest of your stuff. I also want to bring up something about these headers though, and I'll be curious to hear other stuff, but the job of the section headers is to, one, it'd be nice if they kind of told part of your story. Like, these are pretty generic section titles. Okay, sometimes that's hard. Okay. The other job is just to tell people, like, what is the section about? Okay. The more important information is the stuff in the sections, not the header. And I think these kind of blocks, big blocks of dark color, I think they attract too much attention. They draw our eye really strongly. Now, it's nice to add some color, but I really prefer to have just colored text on the white background. And here you need to, like, the text even has to be smaller because you need some color on both the top and the bottom. So that's the first change you'll see is I basically like took this and showed her how it looks with colored text for the headers rather than these two blocks of color, which I think draw your eye too much. Yeah.
I really don't know why the discussion section was left blank.
Yeah, that's just, she's just not done with the whole draft yet. This is just a rough draft, getting some feedback before she sinks too much more time into it. Yeah.
Then the text, the method, some text there in the method seems to be not really clear or large enough.
Okay, so like maybe this is getting too small
Like,
here.
oh, yes.
Yeah, there may actually be some variations in size. It is a little strange that like this section has smaller text. I think she did it just so it'll fit next to that diagram, but that inconsistency in text sizes, I think we want to address. There's also some issues like in most posters, you don't need figure numbers. Okay, you need figure numbers in a manuscript. You're going to refer to a figure, but it's on a different page. Every once in a while, someone will want to refer to figures in multiple places and they need a figure number. Most of the time, you don't need them in posters. we have some big proximity problems here, okay? Especially in the center section. When you first glance at it, it looks like this figure 1 caption goes with figure 2. Like these are a block, then there's a bunch of big space around the plot for figure 1. It doesn't let us group things properly. There's inconsistent spacing kind of between sections. Sometimes you can't avoid that, but think of this proximity. What should be close to what? You know, the myocytoma up there is closer to the header than it is to the bullets that are underneath it that it kind of goes more with. So think about those things. And then I tend to feel like, I'm not a huge fan of having, okay, there's a combination here. The title, I think, is a little too small. When I glance at it, like I look at the body and then I look at the title, it feels a little tiny, like it got shrunk up there. I don't really like the centered multi-line text. It's a little harder to read. I know what a lot of your posters are going to have that. It's fine. I don't tend to prefer it. I like left aligned titles. The other thing I like about left aligned titles is it moves some of the logos. I tend to move them over to the right because I don't want the first thing that people notice since we read top down, left to right in this society. The first thing people are noticing in some cases is the logo. It's fine if your affiliations are there, but it shouldn't be the big highlighted thing. Logos are designed to attract attention. So sometimes I will actually add some transparency to them to like tone them down a little bit, just so they don't pop out a lot more, because my content is more important than, you know, of course, it couldn't have been done without the funders and all those things. It's important, but you need to balance the emphasis. So good job. I'm going to just show you quickly. You know, the first thing that I showed her was kind of changing the headers and left aligning the title and making it a little bigger. So we went from this to this. You know, I like the title better. I think it's a little easier to read. Overall, you know, it is less colorful. This had a lot more color in it, but going to colored headers on a white background gives her more flexibility with the colors. And you'll see in a second, it allowed her to add a secondary color for her subheaders and tune the levels of emphasis. So she went from this to this. So she actually simplified the title, made it much more direct. Potential treatment for pediatric brain tumors gets to the point. Her main red headers still are fairly generic, but she's got these kind of teal subheaders that tell her story. What is myocytoma? What mediates its dissemination? How might we stop it? Bang, bang, bang. That's very compelling. Telling what the results are, not hiding them. This kills patient-derived MC cells. This decreases MEX expression before cells die. So her headers tell her story. It turned out that with her methods, like each method was associated with one figure, so it actually made more sense to put the method right next to the figure. And then she's got this colored takeaway section. What this means, 2 really short points, gets people to that takeaway, future direction, references and acknowledgements, much smaller. I think this is a really, you know, diagrams bigger. This is now a really strong, clear poster that is going to stand out at a poster session. People are going to react to this. So just again, so you know how to get in touch with us, library.duke.edu/data is our homepage. Can help with data sources, R and Python training, GIS, data management, visualization. We will be publishing our new fall workshops in a couple weeks. We're almost ready to do that. So if you go to the upcoming workshop section on our website right now, it's blank, but in a week or 2, it'll be filled in and you can register for workshops. But remember that in the online learning section, we've got recordings of a lot of past workshops. And it's really easy to get in touch. askdata@duke.edu gets to all of us, and we'd be happy to try to help. So, cool. Thanks. Yeah.
So I see on your website you have to drop in.
Mm-hmm.
Like comments,
Yeah, I would say it works fine to do that. So Mondays from 1 to 3, myself and Lauren tend to be there, but it really works well to just email, and we can just set up a time that works for both of us instead of constraining you to that section. So you're perfectly well, it's fine if you drop in for the walk-in hours, but most people just email and we just set up a Zoom or in person or whatever works for you. But yeah, then you just send me your poster draft to talk about it. Question or bidding on the auction item? Cool. Yeah.
So should we use gray instead of black for our text?
I don't know. I tend to just go ahead and use black for a lot of text, but what I like using gray for is sometimes it does look slightly more elegant to not use a pure black. So even if you just use like a 80% black, it looks a little nicer. It's slightly less contrast, but it looks nice. I tend to use it more, I'll use grays more for the things that I want to de-emphasize and go a little further. So I'll have a fair amount of black text, but then the stuff that I want to be there, but a little lower in the hierarchy, I'll make, 70% gray, something like that. Just tone it down 60%. But in diagrams, stuff like that, yeah, think about whether lines need to be black, especially things like arrows between sections. Like arrows, people tend to make like pure black, or big and really dark, and they just, again, draw too much attention. Arrows can usually be toned down a lot. So I'll make them like thick and gray, light gray, and you'll see them, but they're really not the highlight of the story.